the Israel lobby is working overtime right now to destroy the anti-war team that Trump has assembled at the Pentagon. And of course, we learned over the past few days that this team of Tulsi Gabbard, of Pete Hegseth, of Susie Wiles, and others forced his hand. I don't know if he really forced his hand. It seemed like he didn't want to do it in the first place, to kind of push him to make sure that he's not actually going to attack Iran, or at least be party to an attack against Iran. Now, we've learned here at Redacted that former Israeli Mossad agents are working overtime on both social media and behind the scenes, trying to discredit Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Neocon Mike Waltz has now hired basically a dual citizen and former IDF official to work under him. And 3 anti-war DOD officials were just fired. Friend of the show, Tucker Carlson, just interviewed one of them. That man sitting there with Tucker is Dan Caldwell. And I want you just to watch Tucker's summary of what just happened to Dan Caldwell. I think he sums it up perfectly. Watch.
Dan Caldwell is a Marine Corps veteran who wound up until 3 days ago advising the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, on military policy. He was one of the strongest voices in the U.S. government in the Trump administration against the war with Iran. And his rationale was simple. It's not in America's interest, and many Americans will die, and billions will be spent on a war we don't need to fight. And as someone who fought in Iraq, he was able to take that case to the principals with some force. Then, 3 days ago, he was fired from the Pentagon. But not for his views on Iran, no. Dan Caldwell was fired because, reporters are told off the record, he had leaked classified documents to the media. But what were these classified documents exactly? Well, no one at the Pentagon could know the answer to that because Dan Caldwell's phone was never examined, nor was he given a polygraph. So actually, beneath the headlines was nothing other than a false accusation. Was Dan Caldwell fired because he opposed the push to war with Iran? You decide.
You decide. What do you guys think? Well, Lieutenant Colonel Dan Davis knows a thing or two about being canceled by being anti-war, specifically anti-war with Iran. He almost worked for the Trump administration until the neocons and Israel lobby made sure that he certainly didn't. Lieutenant Colonel Dan Davis joins us now. Colonel, great to see you. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, we've been wanting to have you on for a long time. Schedules conflicted. I think you had a live show simultaneously, so we couldn't get you on live with us. So it's a thrill to have you here. First of all, just at a high level, what do you think is going on at the Pentagon? I don't, is our assessment correct? Do you think that the Israeli lobby, the neocons, are actively trying to undermine President Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth?
I don't have visibility on what may be happening, but I have very strong clarity on what the results are. And there is unequivocal. I watched that interview with Dan Caldwell on Tucker's show. I saw it unfold myself. And any time that you have a situation where you're being accused of leaking classified information, and now then it looks like Hegseth himself is kind of caught up into this in probably a no-win situation, and he's not playing it well, I got to say, because now he's accusing Caldwell and all 3 of these guys of leaking classified information and disgruntled employees and all that. And listen, I can tell you, if you're accused of doing something violating an issue with classified information, that's jail time. That's not just being fired. And the fact that they didn't even look at his phone, he wasn't charged with anything, he wasn't even told with it, that tells you that there's no substance there. And so then the only thing left is there must be some policy issue. And when all of these guys were definitely in the camp that don't go down this path to military confrontation with Iran because it would be catastrophic for our interest. Forget about Iran, frankly, but even for ourselves, it would be terrible. And with these guys were known as that position, and they were all the ones that were let go, then something else is going on.
Well, and you had the mainstream media. Sorry, I just want to say the mainstream media jumped right all over this story. I had someone in the chat room just saying, hey, I've never watched your show before, but this guy clearly leaked information. You guys are spewing BS. Basically, this person saw it in the mainstream media. So the mainstream media, spread this information immediately. but they don't have any facts. Where are their sources on it? His phone wasn't used. They did not charge him with anything. So where's the mainstream media getting this BS story from?
And can I follow up before you move on? Because you said that Pete Hegseth is not handling this well. What should we be hearing from him? What could he do better?
Listen, I know Caldwell. I've known him for 7 or 8 years, and he has been at the height of following the rules, of being terribly dedicated to the country. Obviously, he's a combat veteran himself, has never shown anything except the highest of standards of morality, integrity, etc. So when I first heard this, I knew something was off right away. And because he had shown such loyalty to Hegseth and had followed him in there and taken this job, and he knew, Caldwell did when he went into this, as all of us did who were even up for any of these positions, we knew the headwinds we would be going up against, and he was willing to take that chance. And unfortunately, I didn't see loyalty in the other direction. I think that Hegseth should have told whoever was behind all this stuff that they needed to just freaking pound sand. Because consider this. Hegseth is the number 2 guy in the chain of command for the United States Armed Forces. So if it wasn't the number 1 guy, President Trump, who put pressure on him, and I see no evidence it was, then who else had the power and the pressure to compel Hegseth to let go somebody who was tremendously loyal to him? That's the part I think he's misplayed. He should have stood up and said, no, y'all pound sand. This ain't happening.
I think the deep state is actively working to undermine President Trump. I think it's clear as day what's going on right now. I don't understand. I can't wrap my head around what you just said, which is if he's the head of the Pentagon, he's the Secretary of Defense, how do 3 guys who advise him get fired and he doesn't have really a say in it?
Right.
I would love to see by the end of the week these guys get reinstated. To me, that's like the ultimate power play, because all of the media, like the Mossad agents who have taken over social media and the bot army that's out there now pushing this narrative about Hegseth. You can see it in action, by the way, and you can see the counts that are actually posting this. They're former Israeli Mossad agents. They're all pushing the same thing, that Hegseth will be out by the end of the week. Wouldn't the ballsy move here for the Trump administration to rehire these people?
That would be a ballsy move. I would like to see it. Anything that pushes back on. Look, I have to confess, I don't have any knowledge about Mossad agents or any of this other stuff that you're talking about there, but I can see unequivocally some big power is exerting pressure on the United States Department of Defense that's causing the Secretary of Defense to take action that doesn't really make any sense on the surface of it. And I would love to see him bow up and say, no, you know what? Our investigation did not reveal anything. We checked into it, and these guys have been faithful to their jobs, and they're going to be rehired. Now, whether they would do it and come back is a separate issue, because some of those bridges may have been burned, but I'd like to see them do something to take power back for our country.
Now I'm going to offer you this glass half full interpretation, and let me know if you think this is naive, because I have noticed that as the negotiations with Iran continue to be productive, according to the Trump administration.
And excellent. Their words were excellent.
Right. That the crescendo of pro-war rhetoric is ramping up. And so we see attacks on Joe Rogan that they think that they can sort of tamp down his anti-war stance against Iran. We see attacks on people in and around the inner circle that are against a war with Iran. But it seems like because we have the agency of social media, people are not buying it. So is it possible that this is the first lie-based war that is thwarted because of independent media? What do you think of that?
Well, I certainly hope that's the case. I actually had on my own show earlier this afternoon, I had Doug McGregor on, and we were talking about this very issue here. And I showed a couple of clips from, two of the biggest warmongers there are in former General Jack Keane and Senator Tom Cotton, who have just been going over the top, talking about how we should be afraid of Iran, and they have this existential threat, which is complete military nonsense. And we totally shredded that military argument on it at its surface here. But we have seen, because Trump himself on March 7th, I think it was, from the Oval Office, made it sound like we had made the decision to go to war with Iran. And then now that since he's had a change of heart and he's like saying, no, let's try this negotiations. And I think it has a shot at success. And we're doing everything we can to encourage that path, because that is absolutely the best thing for the United States.
How devastating would it be for the United States, or how devastating would it be for Israel to attack Iran?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're hyping so much is that you can, if you want to, you can hate Iran. That's an individual choice. But when you're talking about taking military action, you have to ask the big question, and then what? You launch missiles, and then what? What is Iran going to do in response? What can Iran do to Israel? What can Iran do to even American interest or to our allied interest in the region? Can we take them out militarily, or can we only harm them? And if we only harm them, then what? What's the next level? Because now you've got an open-ended war that could be devastating to the global economy, that could be causing many of our troops who are in vulnerable positions, especially in Iraq and in Syria, that would be very vulnerable to Iranian ballistic missiles, as well as some of these other organizations in Iraq that are friendly to the Iranian regime. All kinds of things could happen if we push Iran into a corner. And by the way, the worst of those potentially would be compelling them to finally make the decision to have a nuclear weapon. No matter how many bombs you may drop, we may not be able to knock that out. So everything bad could happen if we go down this path, and I don't see anything good that could happen.
Are you worried about what happens at the Pentagon?
Of course I am. Again, because of that issue that Doug and I talked about on the show this afternoon, that the number 2 guy in the chain of command of the United States Armed Forces apparently was compelled to take action against his own interests because these guys were so loyal to him. Then you have to wonder what is going on and who's, if not pulling strings, who's putting pressure on that can actually cause the Secretary of Defense to have to blink on his own team. So I think that's the bigger question for me, is what's going on behind the scenes that we don't see. And maybe you're talking about some of it there.
Can I ask a follow-up to something that Natalie asked earlier about the mainstream media and because of social media now getting out these messages? You mentioned someone like General Jack Keane. Now, when I worked at Fox News and I worked with Pete Hegseth, I mean, he was my co-host on a show together, for crying out loud. And they would put on these like warmongers all the time, like General Jack Keane, and, wants to go to war with China. He wants to go to war with everybody. It seems like the mainstream media is now having to walk a really delicate line here. They're sort of having to sit on the fence because here, like, Pete worked there and they have him on the show and they're interviewing him. But at the same time, then they're also putting on these warmongers and these analysts like General Jack Keane and these other warmongers pushing, John Bolton and these other nut jobs, trying to push us into a war with God knows who. So I think they're in a real pickle right now because they got a guy that used to work there that they're trying to interview and still curry favor. It's like access journalism. They don't want to burn that bridge.
Right. They don't. And I think to your comment a second ago that most of the American people aren't buying it because they see that this just doesn't make sense and what they're being told doesn't line up with what they see. And of course, I'm encouraged by that. We try to propel that same issue on our own show here by putting out the truth. And here's what's really going on and things that make sense and it's logical and rational. And, anything we can do to keep going down that, which is why I applaud you guys for covering this issue the way you are. But I hope that the mainstream media is uncomfortable with this and has to not just walk a fine line, but get back on the right side of the line and cover things that actually are true and real. And if not expose who's trying to push pressure on the United States to take action antithetical to our interest, let's just put forward people who are telling the truth and have them on Fox News more.
Well, there are new insider allegations that it was one of his deputies that was running the show and making these firing decisions, which is interesting because your point is well taken. He's in charge. How can he not thwart that if that's what he really wants? Now, again, he was Clayton's co-anchor. As a family, we find him to be a very sincere person. My take on it is that he was prepared for the media storm around his own personal life, but maybe was not prepared for the dark forces that might undermine him once he took the job. Maybe because I don't know why, right? Because who would see this coming? Because the pro-war faction is just so strong and deep-stated, if there's such a word.
And he also was very pro-Israel. He was also very pro-Israel. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, and that's fine. I'm pro-Israel, but I'm also pro-truth. And just to be clear on that, and I actually went on Fox and several other networks when his name was first announced as being nominated for Secretary of Defense. And I said, listen, I think that the charge that he wasn't qualified, he hadn't run a big business, he wasn't a general and all that stuff. I said, listen, the guys who have all these qualifications have been doing a terrible job in the past. Maybe we need a breath of fresh air. And if he can do the things that he said and, reorient the Pentagon, bring back the warrior ethos, hold people accountable, set higher standards. I said, those are all fabulous things we really need. And so I said, let's give him a chance. But I said, I warned at the time, right at the beginning, he will run into some huge headwinds because the edifice that is the Pentagon, they love the status quo. They love these guys that are highly qualified, the former generals, because everything's comfort and they can control that. But now that somebody like Hegseth comes in, and I recommended that he needed to fire a bunch of generals at the beginning because of these people who would be against him and would undermine him needed to be out of the way and hired by people who were qualified and capable, but also aligned with President Trump's vision. That only a couple of people got let go, and I don't think enough of them did, and that might have been a real problem.
I hope. I think you're right about that. The deep state is strong, and the dumping and the emptying of the swamp has not gone far enough. And that was certainly the mistake of President Trump's first term. He didn't drain the swamp at all. In fact, he added to it. So hopefully this time he's learned a bigger lesson. We'll see how the week plays out, though. Will Hegseth have a job by the end of the week? Maybe will these guys be reinstated by the end of the week? We'll see. Colonel Dan Davis, appreciate you joining us.
Excellent context. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Yeah,
My
it's
pleasure. Thanks for
really
having
a
me.
pleasure.